Good morning, good afternoon, good evening guys, gals and gentlebods, and welcome back to the shed. Yes, we are in the shed, and hopefully this will be the final instalment of rebuilding Morty's gearbox. So basically what I'm doing is taking a late model Sprite midget rib case gearbox and converting it to close ratio straight cut gear set. So without further ado, let's crack on with it. Right. So the first parts I want to install are the lay gear and its two shims. So the large one goes at the front of the box, the small one goes to the rear of the box. Now, the easiest way I've found to do this is put a smear of grease on the large one and use that to stick it in place to the front of the gearbox casing. Now the lay gear goes in through the main shaft hole and then lower it into place, and then I've got a long Allen key, well it's actually a Torx key but same difference, that I can pop through, and I can use that as a dummy lay shaft because that will help to keep the two shims in position, because otherwise they can fall through. But we don't want the proper lay gear, we don't want the proper lay shaft in place, because then we can't get the other gears in. So now we've got that in place, I can slide the rear shim into position and then pass that Torx key through, and that will hold the lay gear in loose position. Right. Next piece in is the reverse gear idler. So that goes in there, and then the shaft has got a hole in it which lines up to a hole in the bottom of the casing, and there's a pin that screws in to locate it. So line the hole up roughly in line, and that's just grease on the shaft, not rust, before anybody thinks otherwise. So we'll just give it a light smear of grease just for initial lubrication. It's not terribly necessary, because once you've put the gearbox back in the car and put the oil in it, most of these parts are submerged in oil. Right, so we pop that in, and that shaft has got a screwdriver slot in the end, so that you can rotate it to line up the locating pin, which is there. Now what you can do is, using a torch, shine it in, and you can see the hole in the shaft and get it lined up ready. And then when you pop that pin in, the end of it should engage with the shaft, and that's nipped up. That's located nicely, so we just nip that. Right, so now you've got a better view. The next piece to go in is of course the first motion shaft, which goes from inside the gearbox. So that's been sitting in the freezer for a week or two now, so it's nice and cold. It should be down around about -20 degrees, so that will have shrunk, and hopefully that should be a nice easy fit into the hole in the front casing. So I'll go and fetch that and we'll see what happens. Right, so there's the first motion shaft, all nice and frosty. Just wipe the worst of the frost off that bearing, and then that will hopefully go straight in, like so. So that's in. Gone in slightly further than necessary so that I can get the circlip onto the end of the bearing. So if I flip that box up on end, so now you can see the bearing, and we should be able to get that circlip on. It can be a bit of a fiddle just to get one end started and then work it round. So you may not be able to see very clearly because of my hands in the way. Just need a longer screwdriver, just be able to hook that circlip fully into the groove in the bearing. There we go. And then we can tap that bearing down fully home into the casing. Try to do this evenly all the way around. It's better to use a brass drift if you can, but I don't have one to hand. So that's nice. Right. So that's the first motion shaft in place. Now the main shaft assembly can go in next. So I need to make sure I've got the 4th gear bulk ring in position and the nose bearing for the main shaft. So I'll have a little dab of grease on that. A little dab of grease on the main shaft itself. Dab of grease on the outside of the bearing. That can go on there. Now you have to move this in. If you move the reverse gear idler forward, you can get that in and just rock it past the reverse gear idler. Get that nose gear to engage. And the nose bearing to engage rather. Now at this point we need to stand the gearbox up on end. So I need to first of all put that dummy lay shaft in the opposite way, and because the first motion shaft nose stands slightly proud of the front end of the bell housing, I just need a couple of strips of wood to stand the gearbox up on end, so that we're not ending up sitting on the nose first motion shaft. I know what I meant. Right. Let me reposition things slightly so that you can see a bit better what's going on. Right. See, in the rear bearing housing there's a dowel, and in the rear extension housing there's a hole. So that hole lines up onto that dowel, and now we can turn that so that the bolt holes line up. And now I should be able to tap that rear bearing housing in and just tap the main shaft down into position so that bearing is fully down. Just make sure we've got no slivers of wood off the mallet. And now if I can get the lay gear lined up, that's it. So now I can install the new lay shaft. Now one end of the lay shaft has got a half cut away. That goes at the front end into the bell housing. I don't want to let that go because that could just drop straight through. So we'll rock the gearbox over onto its side again. Get that block of wood under there. Get that piece of wood out from there. So that's all the gear set in, and that looks really nice. I'm very pleased with that. I've used the lay gear shims out of the Morris gearbox because the lay gear shims out of the spridget gearbox were a bit cruddy. They're a little bit pitted, so they weren't in great condition. That one particularly is quite rough. They would have probably done, but they weren't great. They can go in the fucket bucket along with the other crap. Right, the next step is the selectors. There's not actually many bits, but it is a little bit complicated as to which bits go in first. So I downloaded this information, I think it was on the Dorset Morris Minor Owners Club, and this gives good information, a good breakdown of which bits go in which order. So the first selector rod to fit is the reverse selector, which goes in that hole, and we need to put the reverse gear selector fork in, which goes on there like that, and slide the rod in, and that one can go all the way in until that detent slot, that detent groove, is in line with that hole, and that is where the double-ended doobly firkin goes. So I pop that in and just gently push it down with a tool, a screwdriver in this case. Slide the reverse selector shaft in until you feel that double-ended detent drop into it, and now the fork, slide that back, and with one of these bolts in through the oil drain hole. I've dropped a boo-boo because what I should have done first is put all of the selectors in. So that's the first, second selector, and that goes with that hole facing the hole in the casing. Slot that on, and that sits astride the gear teeth. And then the third, fourth again goes in with the bolt hole facing out, so we can get the nut on, get the locking pin in. But that goes in like so, and the reason I had to go backwards was because the reverse selector shaft passes through. That's the third, fourth selector, so the reverse selector shaft passes through that hole. And that was what I'd forgotten. Like I said, there's not too many bits to it, but it can be a little confusing if you're not paying attention. Right, the next part in is the first, second selector rod, which goes in that hole there, pass it through all the way, line up the hole in there, and locking pin with its lock nut and washer. Make sure that's located in the hole. Make sure the lock nut isn't bottoming before the bolt itself, because the bolt needs to bottom into so it's firmly locating in the shaft. Like so. Then we can nip the locking nut. Finally, the third, fourth selector, which goes in the only remaining hole there. Pass that through, pass it through as far as that, because we've got indents to go in this end through some of these holes. Right, so we want one of these interlock ball bearings, and that goes in to that hole and push it down. That's it. So you push it down, that goes past that shaft. The reason we put that shaft in part way is to stop that ball dropping out of that hole and into the gearbox. So we made sure it goes right the way through, because that's an interlock between reverse and first third, third fourth. I'm getting all my numbers mixed up. Now we carefully roll the box over like so. Because we've got an interlock ball into this hole. And again, that one passes right the way through between, so that it's between the third, fourth and the first, second shafts. That's why it's going at that angle. So the purpose of these is that if it's in first or second, you can't engage third or fourth, because if you engage more than one gear at a time, the gearbox will lock up, and if you're driving at the time, it will just destroy itself. So the locking bolt for that can go in. Right, the next step is the detents, and the first one is this one. It's very similar to the double-ended one interlock, but this is a detent. The difference is the interlocks stop you selecting more than one gear at a time. The detents lock the selectors into position when they're in or out of gear. So that one goes in that hole there, and it looks like I've actually already got one in there. Yeah, so that one goes in there, and a spring, followed by that screw with a fibre washer on it. That, if I remember rightly, is a 9/16, and we just nip that. There's no specified torque for these bolts, so it's just a nip. And the next one is that long pin, again with a fibre washer. These fibre washers are in okay condition, so I'm reusing them. So that one screws into that hole, because that isn't actually holding a detent in against the selector shaft. That's just capping off the hole where the interlock ball went in, if you remember. Right, so now the detents can go in. Right, so the detent plunger with the flattened back end goes in the lower of those two holes with a spring behind it. And the other one goes in that hole with another spring behind it. Now it doesn't matter that they're standing proud at different heights, because when we put the side plate on it will compress it down. So that's all fine. Now, because BMC stuff is notorious for leaking oil, and yes, I know there are people that say it only leaks oil if it wasn't put back together properly. Rubbish. I did my apprenticeship in a British Leyland garage. BMC, British Leyland, it's all the same. They leak. So, just giving it a light smear of instant gasket. Just bear in mind this will be full of oil up to about there, maybe a bit higher. So half of this gasket is beneath the oil line and holding back oil. Right, that's that. Pop the gasket on. Be careful not to catch it on the threads of the studs, like that. That's it, just dab that down gently, and then like so. And just be careful if any's gone on the inside face. We don't want it. I don't think it would actually do any harm, but we don't really want bits of silicone floating around in the gearbox. So just give it a wipe off the internal faces. Right. Now those two springs can go in. And then that can go on. Like so. So it's a spring washer and a nut on each of the studs. I like to tighten these down in a diagonal, so we do that one, 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 that one, that one, that one. Right, so that's the side cover on. Right, so the next piece to go in is the front cover. This goes over the first motion shaft, which passes through that hole. In that hole you may just be able to see those grooves. That's a spiral groove. It's called an oil scroll. So as the shaft is turning, any oil that comes through the bearing and tries to pass through there, as that shaft's turning, it will drive it back down that spiral groove and back into the gearbox. So it's a very simple but reasonably effective oil seal system. Right, now what we need to do is set up the clamping distance between that step there and the first motion shaft bearing. The first motion shaft bearing sits proud of the gearbox face and locates into that groove. The purpose of that is to lightly clamp that bearing into the casing to stop it moving. With the traditional standard gearbox where you've got helical cut gears, so with helical cut gears, I can't quite show you because they both go the same way, but because of the taper on, because of the angle, as they transmit power, some of that power is lost in creating a lateral force down the length of the shaft one way or the other. So on power, when you're driving, it would be pushing the gear one way. When you lift off and you're on overrun, it would push the gear the other way. This is why straight cut gearboxes are preferred for motorsport, because they don't waste any power in trying to move that gear along its axis. All of the power, or most of the power, is transmitted through the gears straight into the secondary shafts. So with a helical cut gear, as you put power on, it would try to drive this shaft towards the engine. When you lift off, it would try to drive it back into the gearbox. So what we don't want is for that shaft to be chattering backwards and forwards, because that would wear the hole in the casing that that bearing sits in. So what we need to do is set up that clearance as closely as we can. There we go. So zero the caliper, and first of all measure the depth of that, and I've got 93 thousandths of an inch. So it's quite important to get the caliper as close to perpendicular to that face as you can, because if I tilt it, just to make the point, if I tilt it at an extreme angle, you can see I'm getting a false reading. So you need to be as accurate as you can. And I'm getting 97, 98 thou. So then we repeat the exercise on the bearing to gearbox face. And I've got 97 thou. Yeah, 97 thou. So that depth is the same as the protrusion of the bearing, but we have to allow for the gasket. So the gasket thickness is 12 thou. By the time it's compressed, probably come down to about 10 thou. So we need to put a shim in there. That one's 4 thou, that's too thin. That one's 11 thou, that's close. That one's 10 thou. And that one's 10 thou. So I think if we put a 10 thou shim in, so we put a single, get rid of those for a moment. If we put a single 10 thou shim in, that will take up the thickness of the gasket and allow it to just clamp that bearing in position, locate it properly. What we don't want, if we put too many shims in there, if the shims were too thick, it would clamp the bearing, but this plate would be held off the end of the gearbox and then it would leak oil. And obviously we don't want that, because the clutch lives in this area and we don't want that getting coated in oil, especially gearbox oil, and we'd like to keep the gearbox oil inside the gearbox. So that's that. So I'll just put a little dab of grease into there, just to hold that shim in place while we fit it. And then, as before, a light just a smidgen of instant gasket. I'm just wiping that, so it's just literally a thin film, just to help that gasket seal, take up any minor imperfections in the surfaces. You've got to bear in mind that these components we're working with are ancient, almost as old as me, probably 50 to 60 years old, most of these components. That goes on like that. Now it's also worth bearing in mind that this end of the leg shaft needs to be in line, because it's got a cutout, if you remember, so that needs to be in line with that D shape in there. So put a smidgen of sealer on this side of the gasket. You don't need to put a lot on, just a thin film just to help it seal. If you put too much on, it just gets squeezed in and it'll end up inside the gearbox. It's not really going to cause any harm, there's no filters or anything in there to get clogged up with it, but it's better to do it right the first time, isn't it? Right, so that can go on there like so. And again, as with the side casing, tighten them up diagonally opposite each other. Just evens out the pressure on the plate that you're tightening up on. So that's that. Everything still turns nice and freely. Right, now we'll stand her up on end and put the rear casing on. Right, so with the gearbox stood on end, make sure that's clean. We need to do the same basic setup here as the front end, so we need to measure the distance between that bearing surface and the casing. So again with a pair of calipers, but this time we're going to use a straight edge. Steel rule will do the job. So we put that across there and we measure the distance there. Not always easy. Right. I don't know whether you can see that. I'm getting 270 thou, 0.27. Try it this side. And yeah, 0.27. So I've got 270 and you can see that. Measure that. I got 270. Yep, 270. So allowing for the gasket thickness, which we said was 10 thou, it's going to be the same at this end. I want a 10 thou shim in there, and that one's 10 thou at that point. So again, a little dab of grease in there, just to hold that shim in place while we put this together, like so. I've knocked the lock tab up, tighten that all up. They say a finger of fudge is just enough. I'm inclined to agree. So there we go. And now this can go on. So we lower that down carefully. And it's slightly wrong. It's better to be able to see into there. Because as you lower it down, you have to locate looking at this other one. So as you lower it down, that leg has to engage into the forks of the selector rods. So that's all good. Now this again is the tail housing from the Morris Minor gearbox, the original one that I bought, not the original one out of the car, because this is the one that I reamed that bush, put a new prop shaft bush in and reamed it out to suit. So this is the best one I've got. So that's that. Now the final part to go on is the gear change extension. Which is here. So I've already cleaned this up, prepped it. There's a nylon cup that goes in there and that ball engages in, which seems to have been misplaced during the messing about we've had with these gearboxes. I found the nylon cup, so that goes in there like so. I'll stick a splodge of grease in it, because although this area is still connected to the volume of the gearbox itself, it doesn't get a lot of lubrication because of where it is. It's literally only splash. So we have a gasket for there, but there also needs to be a gasket on there which is purely to make up for the thickness of this gasket, so that the extension housing doesn't sit cocked. So as before, now unfortunately I didn't get a new one of these little gaskets for the back, so I'm just going to reuse the original. Not perfect, but it will do the job. Right, so this really isn't critical. It would be perfectly alright without any of this sealant, but not everybody will agree with this, but I like to just put a thin smear on. And back in the day we used to use blue Hylamar, which was a very good gasket sealant. These silicone sealants are really good, but you don't need a lot of them, especially on gaskets. Right, so that's that. That should go onto there. That feels promising. So I can tighten them down. give those a gentle nip. Right. I think the battery in me ratchet needs charging. It hasn't done bad, it hasn't been charged for over a year. And reverse. Beautiful. Right. Finally, I have a working close ratio straight cut gearbox for Morty the 40. Right, that just about concludes this epic adventure of converting a Morris Minor, MG Midget, Austin Sprite, rib case, call it whatever you like, gearbox to straight cut close ratio. I think I've mentioned before the benefits of the close ratio straight cut setup. The straight cut gears transmit more power, they lose less power because helical cut gears impose lateral forces along the axis of the shaft which takes some power. Straight cut gears don't do that, so you transmit more of the power through the box that you're putting in. You lose less power in the transmission, which is all good. When you're only playing with 40 horsepower last year, hopefully when I've got the new engine built 65ish, but even so, when you're only playing with 65 horsepower, the more of those horses that you can get to the back axle, the better. The only parts I've got left to fit on this gearbox now are the speedo pinion drive and the clutch release fork. This is the one that came out of the spridget box. The thrust bearing, the clutch release bearing, has had it's lost all of its carbon, but the rubber boot is better than the one I'd got, so I'll salvage that. I'll compare this release arm to the one out of Morty's original gearbox and I'll choose which one's the best to fit. So that's about it. All that remains then is for this, once the engine's built, to be assembled with the engine and fitted back in the car. We're getting a lot closer now. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I'm just hoping that it doesn't end up to be a train coming the other way. I hope you found this interesting, maybe useful. If you're considering doing a straight cut close ratio gearbox conversion yourself, hopefully by watching these few videos I've done on it, you will be forewarned of the potential pitfalls. Hopefully I've made the mistakes so you don't have to, as the old saying goes. So if you've enjoyed it, hit the like, the subscribe, the notifications, and I'll see you in the next video, which should be the first stage of rebuilding the engine. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.